We find ourselves at a time when the Catholic Church is going through a great crisis. While many understand there is a crisis, few seem able to understand the reason why. Most are reluctant to admit that this crisis is the result of the Church being infiltrated by her enemies. These infiltrators launched their attack on the Church at the Second Vatican Council. They succeeded in introducing changes to doctrine and worship, which are opposed to the Catholic faith. In fact, these changes were of such a nature that one must conclude that this council actually created a new church. By all outward appearance, these infiltrators succeeded in destroying the church, and yet the church is not defeated. There is still a remnant of true Catholics who tenaciously cling to the faith of their fathers. What is sad is that at this time of such turmoil and confusion in the church, there has arisen division among that small remnant who yet cling to their faith. The question that causes so much difficulty is, how can the church that is assisted by the Holy Ghost teach heresy? How can the infallible church of the present contradict the infallible church of the past? It is unfortunate to see someone escape from the Novus Ordo, only to find such division among the remnant church. But the adage is true: if the shepherd is struck, the sheep will be scattered. To avoid scandal, there are those who propose that unity can be achieved among the remnant church by simply overlooking these differences. But true unity can never be achieved by ignoring error. Error must be confronted head-on. A church that cannot teach error cannot contradict itself, but yet that is exactly what Vatican II did. How can we explain this apparent paradox? There are several different solutions that have been proposed to explain this difficulty. However, they can all be boiled down to two main categories: recognize and resist, or seed vacantism. The Catholic remnant are divided as to which of these explanations is correct. However, seed vacantism is the only solution that does not contradict church teaching. Seed vacantism is simply the theological position that maintains that the chair of Peter is currently vacant. It is vacant because all the men who have claimed to occupy this office since the Second Vatican Council do not hold the Catholic faith and are therefore ineligible to be pope. Although the seed position was developed before recognize and resist, it has always been the minority position. To say that the chair of Peter is vacant was a step too far for many Catholics. It is not that there is a theological reason against it. It's just that many simply believe that it is not possible. The vast majority of what has come to be known as the traditional movement have adopted the theological position of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. Bishop Lefebvre founded the Society of St. Pius X, which recognizes the post-conciliar popes as true popes, but maintains that they must be resisted, or to put it another way, they openly disobey the man they acknowledge as pope. Now, at least initially, Archbishop Lefebvre seemed to go back and forth on the seed issue. However, there is reason to believe that his waffling may have simply been a tactic used in negotiation with Rome. But regardless of Bishop Lefebvre's initial waffling, he eventually settled on a hardline position firmly against seed vacantism, and the Society of St. Pius X, which he founded, continues to maintain that it is not possible for the chair of Peter to be empty. But there were still a few inside the society who understood that resisting a true pope is incompatible with the Catholic faith. On the one hand, the evidence indicated that the chair of Peter must be empty, and yet they had come to believe that seed vacantism went contrary to church teaching. How to solve this dilemma? It was out of an attempt to resolve this difficulty that the Thesis of Cassisiacum was developed. The thesis was first conceived of by the eminent theologian and professor in the Society Seminary at Icone, Father Gerard de Laurier, who would later become Bishop de Laurier. He was unsatisfied with the recognize and resist position to address the problems of Vatican II. However, he started from the false premise that the chair of Peter must always be occupied. To solve this dilemma, he developed a thesis that split the baby. Father Gerard de Laurier developed a kind of hybrid, partial seed vacantism, a theory whereby the chair of Peter is empty without actually being empty. Incidentally, after developing his thesis, Father Gerard de Laurier was asked to leave the Society Seminary because seed vacantism, even if it's only a partial seed vacantism, is unacceptable to the Society of St. Pius X. Now, the thesis originated with Bishop de Laurier, but it was the former SSPX priest Donald Sanborn, now Bishop Sanborn, who became the chief apostle for the spreading of the thesis in America. Donald Sanborn was one of 9 American priests who were expelled from the Society of St. Pius X in 1983. But their departure from the Society of St. Pius X did not concern the Cassisiacum thesis. In fact, it was not until 1990 that Bishop Sanborn adopted the thesis. Seed vacantism as a theological position was first proposed in the late 1960s, and from the 60s until the 90s, the thesis of Cassisiacum was still basically unknown. At least it was unknown to the seed vacantists in America. That is, until Bishop Sanborn became an advocate for it. And after he embraced the partial seed vacantist position, Bishop Sanborn became a kind of thesis salesman. He went around and tried to convince those who had already been seed vacantists for many years that they had a problem that, before he arrived, no one had ever known existed. The thesis salesman will raise a number of objections to what they pejoratively call total seed vacantism or totalism. However, upon examination, all of these objections fall short. But before looking at these objections, let us take a minute to review exactly what the thesis of Cassisiacum involves.
If Francis were just a heretic by himself, but left the church alone, and if the Catholic faith were being promoted just as it was before the council, well, that would be a problem for cardinals to figure out. It's not my problem.
The thesis maintains that if the man who was elected pope publicly holds a heresy, that's fine. The problem is not his personal heresy, but rather his evil intention to promote a false religion.
Our problem is that they are imposing this false religion, and they are therefore manifesting an intent which is contrary to the good of the Catholic Church, the essential good of the Catholic Church.
This evil intention to promote heresy acts like an obstacle to the acceptance of the election.
So we cannot say, for example, that these people that are occupying the Vatican buildings or episcopal chanceries have the power to teach, rule, and sanctify the church, because they are teaching false doctrine and they are promoting a false religion. But at the same time, we are going to say that they have a legal claim to succession, the mere succession of one bishop to another, the mere succession of one pope-elect to another, without having the power to rule the church. So we would say that they are bishop-elects and pope-elects.
As the thesis goes, the post-conciliar popes were validly elected, but they did not validly accept their elections. Therefore, they are not true popes. They are considered to be pope-elect. What is peculiar about the thesis is that even though these elections are not accepted, they still somehow remain valid, and therefore they continue to be pope-elect indefinitely.
The thesis is going to say that because they are not declared heretics, and because therefore they are still legally in the church, and because they have been legally designated to their places, including Francis, by a legal election, that the continuity of the legal continuity of the hierarchy is there. And on the other hand, they are not promoting the mission of the church, but we, Catholic clergy, who have retained the faith, are preserving the mission of the church. And we will show how, even though these men have fallen into heresy, and even though they promote heresy, they nonetheless, in a particular case, still can elect the Pope and still can designate a bishop legitimately.
According to the thesis, if at some point in the future he would get rid of this evil intention to destroy the church, he would then become Pope. It is a bit unclear who would decide when this evil intention no longer existed. It seems a strange bit of reasoning that would conclude that you do not have the authority to declare that someone is a heretic, but you do have the authority to declare what their intention is.
And the thesis is saying that although these popes and these Vatican II popes and bishops do not have authority to teach, rule, and sanctify the church, nonetheless, they have a legitimate title of succession. That is, that they succeed to their predecessors with legitimate title. that they are ready to receive power because they have that legitimate title, but they cannot receive the power until they intend to teach the Catholic faith and maintain Catholic practices, Catholic liturgical practices, Catholic disciplines. In other words, to restore the faith to the Catholic Church. If they do that, they then receive the jurisdiction to teach, rule, and sanctify the Church. That is our position.
It is understandable how the thesis may have seemed to be an appealing answer in the immediate aftermath of Vatican II. These were, after all, Catholic bishops who had been appointed to their positions by lawful authority. There was still a hope that Paul VI would abjure his heresy. He could have undone all the damage of the Second Vatican Council, but the problem was that Paul VI had no intention of converting. In fact, he did not just hold one heresy, he held dozens of separate heresies. His deviation from the faith was so complete that it must be called an apostasy. And it was not just Paul VI who apostatized. Virtually all the bishops of the Second Vatican Council completely apostatized from the Catholic faith, and since the time of the Council, these bishops have died and been replaced by other apostates. New apostates have replaced old apostates who have in turn been replaced by still other apostates. There is literally nothing left of the faith in the hierarchy of the Novus Ordo Church. Even if the thesis had some merit when it was first proposed, it cannot be held today. The situation today is far beyond what it was in the immediate aftermath of the Council. The status of Pope-elect could not last forever. Could someone be Pope-elect for 10 or 20 years without ever being Pope? Can there be a Pope-elect for 15 years, and then he is replaced by another who is Pope-elect for 26 years, and then replaced by another who is Pope-elect for 8 years, and then another, and so on indefinitely?
So we are going to say in the thesis that Francis is materially the Pope, but formally not the Pope. And you say, well, what does that mean? Is he half Pope? No, that means he's not. Just as the president-elect is not the president until January.
Consider that a president-elect does not have any power to appoint government officials, pass legislation, or perform any official function until he is sworn in as president. And if he did, what would the point of a swearing-in ceremony be? How could a pope-elect appoint cardinals or bishops before he was actually pope? How would that work? As pope-elect, he would have some powers but not others? The thesis is very subjective. Who would get to decide what authority a pope-elect had? Furthermore, a president-elect would not maintain the status of president-elect indefinitely. Consider a man who was elected president of the United States, but before he could be sworn in, it was discovered that he was only 34 years old. He would not remain president-elect until his 35th birthday, whereupon he would be sworn in as president. No, his election would become null and void. When a man receives the sufficient number of votes to be elected pope, he is asked whether he accepts his election. And if he were to decline, his election would not maintain validity. Elections don't last indefinitely. If he were to decline his election, the cardinals do not come back to him the next day and ask him if he changed his mind. No, his status as pope-elect would no longer exist. The thesis is appealing to many. It allows them to claim to be sede vacantis, while at the same time acknowledging a certain kind of validity for the Novus Ordo Pope. He can be Pope when he is convenient, and when he is inconvenient, he can just be disregarded. It allows them to have their Pope and disregard him too. The idea of a Pope-elect or Bishop-elect is a novelty in church history. If you are going to introduce a theological novelty, the burden of proof is on you. The thesis offers a solution without any proof. It cites nothing in the way of popes, saints, doctors of the church, canon law, or theological manuals. Nowhere in church law, or even secular law for that matter, can you find a precedent for an election that would stay valid, even though it has not been accepted. This is why the thesis salesman must start with philosophy.
In order to understand this, there are some preliminary notions which actually are drawn from philosophy, the philosophy of authority, which you must understand in order to understand the thesis.
I think Father Duterte will tell you he heard about it after his first year, and he asked Bishop Sanborn about it, and he said, "Let's talk about it after you finish your 2 years of philosophy, because it will make more sense then."
If you need 2 years of philosophy before you can understand the thesis, perhaps there is a problem with your thesis. Not only is the thesis not taught by any theologian, but Pope Paul IV actually excludes it as even a remote possibility. In the papal bull Cum ex apostolatos officio, Pope Paul IV writes, quote, "If ever at any time it shall appear that any bishop, even if he be acting as an archbishop, patriarch or primate, or any cardinal of the aforesaid Roman Church, or, as has already been mentioned, any legate or even the Roman pontiff, prior to his promotion or his elevation as cardinal or Roman pontiff, has deviated from the Catholic faith or fallen into some heresy, the promotion or elevation, even if it shall have been uncontested and by the unanimous assent of all the cardinals, shall be null, void, and worthless. It shall not be possible for it to acquire validity, nor for it to be said that it has thus acquired validity, through the acceptance of the office, of consecration, of subsequent authority, nor through the possession of administration, nor through the punitive enthronement of a Roman pontiff, or veneration or obedience accorded to such by all, nor through the lapse of any period of time in the foregoing situation. It shall not be held as partially legitimate in any way." Pope Paul IV destroys the idea that a heretic could remain pope-elect. However, the thesis advocates claim that this bull no longer applies. They argue that when the Church issued the 1917 Code of Canon Law, all previous laws not included in this code were made null and void. This argument fails for two reasons. First, it is inaccurate to say that this bull is not included. The footnote for Canon 188, number 4, cites Cum ex apostolatos as the source of the law. This canon reads, quote, "All offices shall be vacant ipso facto by public defection from the Catholic faith." It is therefore disingenuous to say that it was not included in the 1917 Code. And second, the fact that a heretic cannot be pope is a matter of divine law, not ecclesiastical law. Yet Bishop Sanborn would have you believe that before Paul IV wrote this bull, a manifest heretic could be pope. Cum ex apostolatos is rooted in the basic Catholic doctrine that to be the pope, one must be a member of the Church, and to be a member of the Church, one must profess the Catholic faith. This basic principle can be found in the writings of popes, saints, doctors of the Church, and it is expressed clearly in Canon 188 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law. The pre-Vatican II Catholic Encyclopedia states this principle clearly. Quote, "The Pope himself, if notoriously guilty of heresy, would cease to be Pope because he would cease to be a member of the Church." Heretics are excluded from holding the papal office by divine law. If a heretic could be Pope, the Church would not have the mark of unity. The unity of the Church demands that all her members are one in faith. Before Vatican II, this was not controversial. It was simply the Catholic faith. The thesis separates the papacy into form and matter. That is, it separates the papal election from actually holding the papal office.
There is a principle in philosophy that form makes something to be what it is. See, the form that is given to the wood makes it to be the statue of the Virgin Mary. So when you see it, you say, oh, that's Our Lady. If you just saw a log, you would not even think about Our Lady. It's just a wooden log. But the form is what makes it to be what it is. And so the form, the authority, is not in these people. They are not true popes. They are not true bishops. But nonetheless, they do possess legitimate legal designations to be popes and to be bishops.
This is a particularly nonsensical part of the thesis. It perhaps has escaped their notice that in a sacrament, if you do not have both form and matter, you have nothing. For example, in baptism, you can stand in the water all day, but if you don't have the accompanying words, there is no sacrament. Without the words of the form, all you would have is a shower. And secondly, the form must be congruent with the matter. That is to say, they must happen at the same time. You cannot pour the water over someone's head and 10 years later say the words of the form. The advocates of the thesis point to Pope Pius XII, who uses the analogy of body and soul to explain the juridical and social aspects of the Church. The Church is the mystical body of Christ, but the thing about a body is that when it is separated from the soul, the body is dead. The thesis separates the papacy into two parts, material and formal. This is not unlike the modernist Benedict XVI, who thought he could separate the papacy into an active and contemplative part. The papacy divided from the authority, like a body separated from the soul, is dead. An election that is not accepted does not remain valid indefinitely. If there is a failure to accept an election for whatever reason, that would be the equivalent of a rejection. Even if the Novus Ordo apostates had the power to elect a valid pope, once the election is rejected, it is no longer valid. The Cassisiacum thesis is incompatible with the nature of the Church. It divides not just the papacy, but the Church itself into material and formal elements. It separates the Catholic Church from the Catholic religion, as if they were two distinct things.
So we're saying that they have not founded a new church, but they are using the structures of the church in order to promote the heresy. Also, I think it is deceptive that you can be Catholic in the Novus Ordo. You can't be Catholic if you accept the Novus Ordo. These are two different religions battling, and you must take one or the other.
The thesis is teaching that the Novus Ordo is still the Catholic Church, even though it's not the Catholic religion.
You say that it is a separate church from the Catholic Church. It is like the Lutheran Church, therefore, or the Episcopalian Church, which is legally separated as an organization from the Catholic Church. That's what you are accusing the Novus Ordites of being, a separate church. Our position concerning the problem of Vatican II is that Vatican II, is a break from Catholic tradition in all aspects of Catholicism, its liturgy, its doctrine, its disciplines, and that it is nothing less than a new religion, just like Lutheranism or Calvinism, a false religion, alien to Roman Catholicism.
The thesis divides the Church into material and formal elements. That is, it divides the Catholic Church from the Catholic religion. In an official exposition of the thesis that can be found on the Most Holy Trinity Seminary website, they explain their position by dividing the Church into divine and human elements. Oddly enough, this is the exact same terminology used by the Recognize and Resist. Just like the thesis, the Recognize and Resist also believe that the Novus Ordo is still the Catholic Church, and they excuse away all the heresy as being just the human element. How can the Church be one if it is divided into material and formal elements? How can the Church be a visible society if its legal hierarchy is teaching a different religion? The Church cannot be divided and still have the mark of unity. Pope Pius XII, encyclical Mystici Corpus Christi, quote, "Now since its founder willed the social body of Christ to be visible, the cooperation of all its members must also be externally manifest through their profession of the same faith." The visible unity of the Church is made manifest through the profession of the same faith. But the thesis has redefined what is meant by the visibility of the Church. According to the thesis, the Church is visible through its legally elected hierarchy, and it doesn't matter that this legally elected hierarchy does not hold the Catholic faith. However, the visibility of the Church is not about possessing a valid election. It's not about buildings, vestments, or liturgy. The Eastern Orthodox have that kind of visibility. The Catholic Church indeed has both material and formal elements. However, they cannot be separated. One cannot be a member of the Catholic Church without also being a member of the Catholic religion. If you try to separate the Church from the religion, you will be left with neither. Pope Pius XII, encyclical Mystici Corpus Christi, quote, "Actually, only those are to be included as members of the Church who have been baptized and profess the true faith." The Catholic Church is identified by 4 marks. 1. Holy, Catholic, and Apostolic. Like a trademark, they distinguish the one true Church founded by Jesus Christ from all counterfeit imitations. By the mark of unity is meant that Catholics are united through their visible profession of the same faith. How can the Novus Ordo Church have the mark of unity when its so-called legally elected hierarchy is teaching a different religion? The thesis salesmen have coined the term totalists as a pejorative to refer to those who totally reject the Novus Ordo hierarchy. But the Church is never condemned to heresy in any other way than totally. Can you imagine a pope saying, "I condemn this heresy, but only partially"? You cannot be a partialist. You cannot have one foot in the Novus Ordo Church and one foot in the Catholic Church. We are commanded to be hot or cold, for the partialists will be vomited out. Rather than abandoning the thesis, as it came in conflict with the Catholic faith, they have altered the faith to fit the thesis. The thesis salesmen object to the Sede Vacantis position, arguing that it is contrary to the teaching of the Church. The objection argues that it is impossible to have a long period of time without a pope because the First Vatican Council taught that the papacy will have perpetual successors.
Sede Vacantists have a big theological problem to solve. The Sede Vacantists are saying we have no pope, we have no bishops. And it's all gone. See, that there's no authority whatsoever. Well, that poses a serious theological problem, and it is this. How then do you account for the dogma of the Church that there must be an unbroken succession of hierarchy, that is, popes and bishops, from the time of St. Peter until the end of the world?
Pope Pius IX, First Vatican Council, quote, "If anyone then says that it is not from the institution of Christ the Lord himself, or by divine right, that the blessed Peter has perpetual successors in the primacy over the universal Church, or that the Roman Pontiff is not the successor of blessed Peter in the same primacy, let him be anathema." This argument is an example of quote mining. Quote mining is a logical fallacy that uses a legitimate quote, but applies it out of context. Before drawing conclusions as to what the First Vatican Council was declaring, one must consider the context in which the statement was made. The Council was addressing those schismatics who were willing to accept the Pope as the successor of Peter without accepting his primacy. In other words, the Council was condemning those who held that the successor of Peter was only the first among equals, without possessing an authority over the entire Church. First Vatican Council, Dogmatic Constitution Pastor Aeternus, quote, "Whosoever succeeds to the chair of Peter obtains by the institution of Christ himself the primacy of Peter over the whole Church." The Council was teaching that as long as there is a true successor of Peter, he possesses the very same primacy as Peter. However, the thesis salesman will present it as if the Vatican was condemning a group of people who taught that there could be a prolonged interregnum. The First Vatican Council said absolutely nothing about how long the period of time could be between the death of one pope and the election of his successor. The question was simply not addressed one way or the other, and indeed, the Church has never made a declaration limiting the length of an interregnum. What is interesting is that in a very practical way, the thesis is actually teaching the very same error as the Orthodox. They may get from A to B with different reasoning, but they both arrive at the same place, that is a pope who does not possess the same primacy as Peter.
And the thesis is saying that although these popes and these Vatican II popes and bishops do not have authority to teach, rule, and sanctify the Church, nonetheless, they have a legitimate title of succession.
How does the thesis account for the fact that their pope does not possess primacy over the whole Church? This is not a theological opinion. It is a dogma of the Church. For the Church to be apostolic, the successor of Peter must possess the same primacy as Peter. The thesis salesmen object to what they pejoratively call total Sede Vacantism, on the grounds that we cannot say that the post-conciliar popes are heretics until they have been convicted in an ecclesiastical court. However, if a heresy is manifest, that is, evident to all, Catholics are not only permitted, they are required to make a judgment. The Second Vatican Council has never been officially condemned. If Catholics cannot reject heresy unless it has been officially condemned, on what grounds can they reject Vatican II? Consider that every time a Catholic gives his assent to the teaching of the Church, he is making a judgment. And if Catholics are able to determine what the Church teaches and assent to it, it follows that they are also able to judge when something goes contrary to Church teaching and reject it. The thesis argues that no one has the right to declare someone to be a heretic without a ruling from an ecclesiastical court, and yet they do not hesitate to definitively pronounce that the post-conciliar popes have not validly accepted their elections. Now, when these men were elected, they all said that they accepted their elections. It would certainly be news to them to find out that their acceptance was not valid. If you cannot declare someone to be a heretic until they've been convicted in an ecclesiastical court, it seems a little inconsistent to conclude that you would have the right to declare that someone had not properly accepted their election.
An inconsistency is always a sign of error. Whenever you find an inconsistency in your ideas, the light goes on, you're in error. There is something wrong with your system.
Would an invalid election not also demand a ruling from an ecclesiastical court? But consistency is not one of the thesis' strong points.
When did the Novus Ordo Church begin? When was there a break of this Novus Ordo Church from the Catholic Church? Was it when John the 23rd was elected? Was it when Paul VI was elected? Was it when Paul VI promulgated the council? Was it when he promulgated the Novus Ordo Missae? Was it under John Paul II? When did it break? When was the organizational break? When did that take place?
Bishop Sanborn asserts that if you cannot cite the exact moment where the Novus Ordo Church began, then you cannot conclude that it is no longer the Catholic Church. But this is faulty reasoning. Imagine a wife who poisons her husband by putting 1 drop of poison into his food every day. Now, 1 drop of poison by itself is not enough to kill him. However, the accumulation of these daily drops of poison over the course of a year eventually brought about his death. Could the wife raise the defense that she could not be accused of murder because you could not identify the exact point at which the murder was committed? It may not be until the damage is done that you realize a murder took place, but once the plot is uncovered, it would be made clear that the evil intention to commit murder existed from the administration of the very first drop. Imagine if Bishop Sanborn's criticism were correct. That would mean that the enemies of the church would have a foolproof technique whereby they could destroy the church. As long as they introduced the heresy 1 drop at a time, while insisting that it was Catholic, they could completely change the church. They could introduce more heresy than the 16th century Protestant reformers, and yet we would still not be able to say that it was a new church. The thesis salesman will argue that seat vacantism cannot be held unless you are able to demonstrate exactly how the church will get a pope again.
That there must always be in the church some ability to legally appoint bishops and to elect popes. If that should fail, the Catholic Church fails.
But this reasoning is quite flawed. It would be the equivalent of telling a doctor that he could not diagnose a disease unless he also had the cure. The problem of the papacy still exists, whether or not we know how to resolve the difficulty. But it is false to say that there are no solutions that have been proposed. Remember that the method of selecting a pope is a matter of ecclesiastical law, not divine law, which means that as circumstances change, the Church has the ability to alter the way in which a pope will be selected. The current method of electing a pope from among the cardinals took many years to develop. It was not in use for the first 1,000 years of the Church. Originally, the pope was elected by the clergy of Rome and surrounding dioceses. After the time of Constantine, the Roman emperors began to interfere by claiming the right to nominate the new pope. It was not until the year 1059, which was 5 years after the East-West Schism, that the right of electing a pope was reserved to the principal clergy of Rome. In 1179, Alexander III made a rule that the pope must be chosen by a 2/3 majority, and in 1563 the Council of Trent decreed that the cardinals should be chosen from all the nations of Christendom, but that they should remain in their respective countries rather than moving to Rome. To get another pope again does not require the reinventing of the wheel. Consider what the Catholic Encyclopedia has to say about how the Great Western Schism was resolved. Quote, on the principle that a doubtful pope is no pope, the apostolic see appeared really vacant, and under the circumstances could not possibly be otherwise filled than by the action of a general council. The Church has no power over divine law. However, the Church has the ability to change any law that she herself has made. Since the method of electing a pope is a matter of Church law, there is nothing in principle that demands that a pope must always be elected by cardinals. Whether it was the Council of Constance that elected a pope to end the Western Schism, or the clergy of Rome who met to elect the pope in the early days of the Church, or the cardinals who meet to elect the pope today, they are all a type of imperfect general council. It is only the newly elected pope that gives the council authority, and whichever method was used in the past, the validity of the election was confirmed by the universal and peaceful acceptance by the faithful. Even Bishop Sanborn acknowledges this principle. It's just that he looks to the heretical Vatican II clergy to be the electors.
I think that the common acceptance, however, of someone that was elected by even a small group of cardinals or bishops, a common acceptance of traditional Catholics would verify that election. And that's the general principle of law. If somebody is commonly accepted as the Pope, after that heals the election questions.
To be clear, this is not a call for traditional clergy to hold a conclave. Remember that the Council of Pisa was called to resolve a situation where there were two claimants to the papal office, but it only added to the confusion by producing a third papal claimant. We must refrain from imprudent action that would only result in additional confusion. This is only a recognition that the lack of cardinals does not mean the Church does not have the ability to provide herself with a visible head. At the time of the Western Schism, the Church had gone for 40 years without a clearly discernible head, and without a clearly discernible head, the Church was also without clearly discernible cardinals. It was not until the Council of Constance that the Western Schism was finally resolved, and it was only by the election of a pope that the Council of Constance could be ratified. There are those who contend that it does not matter whether you are a total or partial sede vacantist, because the differences between them are not differences of faith. They contend that both positions are Catholic and deposing Vatican II, and while on the surface this may seem correct, there are a few problems with this reasoning. First, we must remember that, just as a disease cannot be properly treated unless it is first correctly diagnosed, so none of the problems in the Church today can be addressed unless they are first correctly identified. A faulty theory about the problems in the Church will necessarily result in a false solution. The adherents of the Thesis are waiting for the greatest enemies the Church has ever known to restore the Church. And second, it is not quite correct to say that the nature of the Church does not involve a matter of faith. The thesis, or partial sede vacantism, cannot be the answer because it is incompatible with the nature of the Church. It divides the papacy by introducing the concept of a pope who possesses a legal material claim to the office without actually possessing the primacy of Peter. It further holds that the legal material hierarchy of the Catholic Church can exist in a false religion. But whether these differences are over matters of faith or not, they nonetheless involve grave error about the nature of the Church. True unity among Catholics can never be achieved by overlooking error. The adherents of the Thesis raise a number of objections to sede vacantism. However, all of their objections are rooted in faulty reasoning. If you need a legal declaration before you can declare a papal claimant to be a heretic, why would you also not need a legal declaration before you declare that he has not accepted his election? And who would have the authority to make such a declaration? Furthermore, there is no precedent to be found, either in church law or secular law, where an election that is not accepted would remain valid indefinitely. Perhaps this is why the thesis salesmen start with philosophy rather than theology.
In order to understand this, there are some preliminary notions which actually are drawn from philosophy, the philosophy of authority, which you must understand in order to understand the thesis.
I think Father Dutertra will tell you he heard about it after his first year, and he asked Bishop Sanborn about it, and he said, "Let's talk about it after you finish your 2 years of philosophy, because it will make more sense then."
The thesis maintains that Vatican II was the beginning of a new religion, but not a new church. If the members of this church elect a pope, what religion would he be pope of? Can the pope of the Catholic Church be a member of a different religion? Again, they don't seem to have thought this all the way through. In order to avoid the obvious conclusion that the chair of Peter is vacant, the partialists contort and redefine the Catholic Church. They split the papacy into material and formal elements. They split Catholicism into a church that is separate from the Catholic religion. But the thing about form and matter is, if you separate them, you actually have nothing. They have a Catholic Church that does not teach the Catholic religion, a pope with legal title but no primacy, and a pope without primacy goes contrary to solemnly defined Catholic dogma. Catholic Crusader Films is solely responsible for the content of this video.